Hi, this is Private Station, and today we're bringing you an interview given by Alexey Arestovych, a former advisor to the Office of the President of Ukraine, a Lieutenant Colonel, to Yulia Latynina, an investigative journalist from Russia. Also, before we jumping into this, I want to say personal thanks to our members. Thank you guys for supporting us. You've been really precious. Much appreciated. And now, without further ado, are there perspectives with Putin's strategy? That's the topic of discussion that Alexey and Yulia had yesterday. Enjoy. Hi, this is Yulia Latynina and Latynina TV. We have Alexey Arestovych as our guest today, as usual, on Wednesdays. Today without his usual title. However, we need to say that Alexey was always working as Alexey Arestovych, first of all. It's difficult to exit that position. So the helicopter crash in Bravary that occurred recently, could that be a diversion? I'm also remembering other crashes, known crashes of Yukos helicopters and others, and what can you say about the ones who died and perished in this crash? I understand you had friends there. No, I did not have friends, but I did know Minister of Interior, Denis Monastyrsky. He was a very calm, strategically oriented person and with a good soft irony feature to his character, which usually also reflects a sharp wit. I was shocked by the news of his death. I did not know Secretary of State and second in command there in the department, so my condolences, and also understand there are some parents and teachers in the daycare who died as well. There was early in the morning when parents started bringing their kids to it, so there were extra victims on the ground, unfortunately. And according to the data of our Ministry of Interior, there were 4 kids dead. Then rescue service came in and corrected the number, so for now I think they're still about to announce the exact number soon, but I do hope that that number will not grow. And as I understand, our specialists are reviewing 3 versions: pilot's mistake, terrorist activity, and diversion. So, speaking with literature in a simple language, it's either a mistake or intended destruction of a helicopter, because those 2 others are basically of a similar caliber. And it will take time. Any air catastrophe investigation takes time. It's not hours. It's not even days, probably. More likely, it'll take some months. The procedure is pretty lengthy. So. All right. We talked about that catastrophe that happened, but there is another pressing topic that we cannot avoid. It's your recent resignation. It's the big elephant in the room, and I'm seeing a lot of words of support in the chat. So let's approach it this way. There happened a terrorist act in Dnipro, which basically Ha-22 has about the same accuracy as Qassam missile or anything that terrorists use. And however, probably the number of civilians who died in this one is probably going to be the biggest number of a single act deaths in this war. And this can be definitely used, could have been used, this incident, to ask for more air defense systems, maybe for Tomahawks, to try to reach the areas where the missiles are being shot from. Probably capitalize one way or another to try to support Ukraine in that fight for life against Russia, and I'm not even going into the intricacies of Russian side, but for a big chunk of people in Ukraine, apparently that task was of a lesser concern than removing Arestovych from his position. Do you have any comments as to why do you think people considered you being as dangerous to them as to a certain group of people than the actual arms? No, I have no comments on that. I do not feel anything special about the resignation. I understand. Okay, Alexey, I think we will not be discussing your resignation. No, we won't. This is an event in the past. Okay, then if you are curious, talk to or listen to the previous stream with Mark. Same topic was discussed there. Any plans for the future? Same as I had before. I'm going to do the same work I was doing. We, with my team, calculated overall coverage, 216 million views. In the first half of January, and this is just on my YouTube channel. This is more than population of Russia. And I'm not even counting internal texts and other things. I think I'm carrying a pretty good work. And if there are people who are continuing to pay attention, to listen to my to what I have to say about this situation, I will continue working. As an officer, I'm trained to be taking responsibility where I'm most effective, and it appears I am effective on this front, so I will continue working here on the information psychological front. All right. We will not repeat the mistakes of those people who were bickering and attacking Alexey in the last few days, and will not be deep diving into that topic. Oh, I forgot to mention, please subscribe to my channel, to Yulia Latynina TV, and to Alexey Arestovych channel. And side note, if you're watching that in English, please subscribe to the privateer station if you have not done that yet. All right, let's talk about Putin's missiles. At first, he tried to reach Ukraine in bulks of 100, 120 missiles. They were the more or less precise ones that fly for 3,000 kilometers, 5,000 kilometers. So these days, they're shooting X-22s, or the ones that are flying 150 and 300 kilometers, not too accurate. What is up with his missiles? Well, first of all, there are much fewer of them left. You can see that by the intervals between the attacks. Remember, there were several times a day, then once per 5 days, once every week. Now we have about 2 weeks between each volleys, roughly. The structure of these volleys changes, and they're starting to even use X-59s, which are anti-radio location systems and anti-air defense systems. They're using them against our energy structure. Then they're using that X-22s, which has very vague targeting with about 300 yards deviation from target. So these are the means they're using on Nikolaev, Kherson, Zaporozhye sometimes. And supposedly they used S-400 on Kiev. First of all, Russia doesn't have too many of them. We had some numbers that they have something like 800 total, but the ones that are redesigned for shooting not air targets but ground targets, probably even less than that. So a fraction of that. And then there's specifics of their use is also different. And it's also not too accurate. It has a deviation of 150 meters at least. And they're using all that assortment not from a good life. Of course, the Russian command does not care about the deaths, and civilians also die, but such use is not effective even in the military application. Because with a weak payload, as 300, as 400, for example, carry, it's difficult to harm the targets they're targeting. And the good ones, the ones that are targeting better and the ones that carry bigger payload, they're running out. And every volley has fewer and fewer of those. But they still have to do something, and so they're using ineffective weapons, that is not selective, that generally hits within the radius of wherever they've been shooting it at. But they continue doing it. We know whom we're dealing with, right? Okay, I have almost a philosophical question here, then let's get back to calibers and X-101s, which are almost new missiles or positioned as new ones. But in the fight against the energy system, against transformers, they're fighting with the efficacy of 8%. Everything else is being shot down. So if they're fighting with NATO, let's imagine, how are they going to fight that war? So I wrote down a statement by Igor Tkachev. Tkachev is the proper name. Okay, so he says all objects of NATO in Europe will need constant 24-hour coverage, because otherwise they'll be destroyed by these calibers. So I'm imagining here sitting that if 90+% of calibers perish just fighting with Ukrainian transformers, what's the percentage of them that might actually have a chance of hitting any target with NATO? So let's start with the fact that 6th Army of the Western Russian Front is about 2 motorized infantry brigades size of NATO. This has not been fully deployed. It was twice destroyed in Ukraine, and they just replaced the head of it again. So I don't know what they can do with that tool. As of the Baltic Fleet, also, Mark Twain has a good phrase from Tom Sawyer: let's put the shroud of pity over the end of the scene. So I'm thinking Russian Navy will probably exist for about 45 minutes after they get an order to attack. In the Soviet times, there were norms. So aircraft carriers are usually surrounded by a bunch of other supportive vehicles, and in order to destroy the core of that group, the carrier, 2 regiments, 2 of them, both of them were written off. So the Soviet hopes at that time was that since they had nuclear warheads, one of them perhaps will reach and might destroy something. And they didn't care about a 600 yards overall deviation because it's not too big of an issue. For several hundred kilotons, the chance of destroying the carrier with a group around it was pretty high, even if one missile goes through the defense. So they were going to get 30 planes in the air and try to hope to destroy everything in that group, with at least maybe one missile that gets through. But if you replace the payload with a regular payload, having a precision of 600 yards, shooting aircraft carrier group or shooting anything on the target on the ground, the chances are very low. Plus, all these planes would be shot down. And this missile is pretty simple. It approaches the target, it turns on its vision, it looks at the target that reminds it of its initial designated target, so they're looking for something like aircraft carrier, something big, and then flies in the direction of that element. So they're using these missiles to attack targets in the cities. This is ridiculous. So I would say the time of existence of the Russian Western Front against anything NATO in Europe will probably be 3 days, and that's till the very last of them is destroyed. Most forces, I think, would be annihilated within the first 24 hours. Just Americans, as a part of NATO, have about 11,000 Tomahawks in the first volley. And Tomahawks are not X-101s. They're more precise. They're flying at more tricky trajectories, much more difficult to intercept. Overall, Russia has used about 4,000 missiles against us in this war, and NATO has 11,000 Tomahawks just in the first volley. Can you imagine that? So Putin twice came to different command centers in Russia, and I have a question related to that. Now, I think his tactics really changed. Now, instead of shooting military targets, he's just shelling cities, probably to just gratify himself and his weird likes. And second is that probably they're using these missiles in order to have successful reporting to him, because they're using some old stashes which were never designed for these targets. And some of them are pretty fast, like X-22s, that air defense systems are not being shot down. So I can imagine that he probably asked the question why Ukraine is shooting down so many of our missiles. So now they dusted off some of these old models that fly fast but are definitely not accurate. And now they're reporting that much fewer missiles are intercepted. So I'm trying to understand what's happening in the head, in the mind of a person who is declaring that he's waging war against NATO, and then he's fighting with Transformers, and after being defeated by Transformers, he switches to his fight to fighting multi-story civilian buildings. I think he probably was visiting these command centers to understand what is going on and what exactly are they targeting, because usually each volley costs them several $100 million. And the effect of their use is much weaker than they initially trumpeted about. And after having spent missiles worth of probably 10 billions or maybe more, he probably came over to ask a few questions. Why is Ukraine still with power? Why Fagin and Arestovych are still in line? We got to do something. Why Ukraine still has electricity? Why their trains is transporting troops, and why the industry is working? Why are we shooting and nothing is happening? So he probably came in with the question why. And the version that they added S-300s and Ha-22s, I think that is a cover their ass operations by generals to basically tell him that they're shooting something that cannot be intercepted. That's super, but that's for them. But it's only additional argument for NATO to supply us with tools that can intercept these high-speed missiles. So I understood, Alexey, that they used S-400 on Kiev. I was curious because, first of all, there are very few of them. It's not S-300. And second, it's difficult to use them to hit a target because S-400, this is anti-air missile. So they usually light up their targets with radar. They have an active targeting warhead that follows the targeting. On the ground, it's nearly impossible to light up the target unless you bring the radar 2 kilometers high up, and Bryansk region doesn't have any mountains, anything of that altitude. And even then, on the ground, you'll have a line wide, several kilometers wide, so the missile can target anything within that line. How would generals explain that to Putin, the use of this? They're probably just doing it straightforward, saying, look, we are awesome. We're shooting them with something that cannot be intercepted. Even their sirens didn't work. At first it exploded and then the sirens went off. They don't know what to do and we're probably winning. And I think that's the chewing gum they gave him. And he probably was happy. And what about the question if they hit the target? Oh, that's not the most important question. They, of course, report him that they hit all the targets, of course. And you think he still believes that? Well, it's always comforting for the person to hear what he wants to hear. Well, yeah, they will point and say, see, the smoke is coming, we hit something, we caused some damage, not sure if we destroyed fully. And after that, they'll probably speak to evil NATO being able to fix the systems, bring repairs, spare parts, cover it with sandbags or something. So basically, we did our job and everything else is somebody else's fault. You think that's their dumb level of planning they use? No, they're basically saying we did hit the target, but since the object is and the target is complex, and Ukraine and the West are undertaking enormous efforts to repair everything, so these damn Ukrainians repair everything real fast. But the moment we get the update that our spies confirmed that everything is repaired, we shoot that area again and destroy it again. So sooner or later they'll run out of spare parts and the patience of the West allies will run out and then they'll fall on their knees and crawl to you begging for negotiations. And I think that's his end goal, ultimately, for now. You know, Alexey, I know a lot about Putin, but I do think that you may be right in this answer. Tackling the issue if he believes that his fight with Transformers will reach the target. Okay, the other question then. It turns out that half of Russian military might, those missiles that they use against Ukraine, was concentrated on one airfield in Engels, which apparently did not have any air defense systems. And after 2 successful booms on that airfield, all that strategic might left the airfield, were forced to move to other locations, and it affected their capacity. And it was not even an Atlas or a Tomahawk, it was just a Strij, which was probably modified somewhere in Ukraine for such use. So do you think there is a potential here for future military actions and for more unexpected military solutions that are kind of custom handmade that you guys can come up with in Ukraine? Well, we're not shooting up Russian territory, right? So it just they're smoking things and they blow up. Oh, okay, so you left the position, but you're still of an opinion that it's a violation of code. Okay. Yeah, I understand. They're still going to be smoking, and there's still going to be explosions happening, and they need to really restrict people deviating from rules. Okay, Alexey, then do you guys think about more non-standard ways to smoke? I think we do, and we actually just recently demonstrated a UAV that flies down to as far as 1,500 kilometers, and they had official presentation today in Ukraine. So here's our homemade UAV, and that's another way of helping Russians to smoke at a more effective rate. Yeah, I hope it's not an analog of Shahed, that it's more accurate than this. Yeah, I'm just bringing that comparison for a reason, to give an easy comparison. So there was a demonstration, and the order was placed by Valery Zaluzhny of that vehicle, and here's a picture of that UAV. It looks nice. Well, it's hard to tell by the picture, but yeah, well, at least we showed, so it exists, right? So we are building something. All right. Let's get back to some technical novelties a bit later. Now, let's get to Putin's propaganda. When things don't work, they first of all jump into some invisible weapons, the ones that nobody sees, Poseidon, Burevestnik, and all. Poseidon, that ship sailing somewhere towards the United States. And then they start talking about events in the future time. Not that we have hit, but we will hit. We will create a government of Ukraine in exile. And so, speaking of that major news that they recently peddling, their propagandists is of a huge offensive. Which part of that story is true? Which part should we be worried about? All right, so Russia has, according to the data in open sources, about 330,000 troops in Ukraine. A couple of months ago, they had 220, 210. So they added about 100,000 to that. And now they can form the strike groups from these new 100,000. And there are not too many directions where they can do it. Everybody knows where. We do not see these strike groups. Fortunately or unfortunately, we do not see them. We see some regrouping to support their defenses. And we see some smaller tactical regroupings in Bakhmut, Solidar, Kremenная, Avdiivka, Marinka. On Zaporozhye, they keep regrouping, which is difficult to gauge for now. It can be used for defense or can be used for offense. There are several groups maneuvering there. And a little bit in Kherson, they're getting some additional troops there, but there is no sign of big strategic groups creation. So we do not see them aggregating in big strike groups. They are trying to scare us with big war, and I don't think we should be afraid of that yet. And the near, God forgive me, 2-3 weeks, we should not be afraid of anything. Yes, they're a little more active on the front. They're using artillery a little more active for the last 3-4 days. That wasn't usually shooting the previous month, but now they're starting to shoot again. However, not throughout the whole front, just Bakhmut-Kremenная region. But we do not see big strike groups, the ones that are capable potentially of breaking through the front line. We do not see any of that serious activity. We see some tactical groups, but that's different. So tactical actions are defined up to 50 to 100 kilometers. Operative, they go further to 200. So it's hard to tell if Putin is even going to do any additional offensive. Our intel did mention that February and March may be difficult, and we cannot exclude that eventuality. But there is another opinion that until they bring more and create additional reserves, they will not waste the current ones, the current troops, because otherwise they will run out of reserves to even hold the line. And this would put them down additional 5 or 6 months till they can aggregate that many people. So we'll see. The opinions are different. Opinions differ on this, and we see some activity on the front. Yes, is it a sign of a big offensive? Very doubtful. Okay, in relation to that, I have another question. When Putin was doing his first offensive, he concentrated about 180,000. No, Yulia, he had 330,000. 220,000 were cadre troops, and then they had so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics and Kadyrov troops. So now Ukrainian army is bigger. You guys are at least 500,000, right? In size. How can he successfully attack the country without having at least a triple force of yours, so 1.5 million? And how could he mobilize that many in Russia? Because they initially planned that first wave of mobilization to be 300,000, and they maybe processed 200 out of that. So I'm not really tracking math here. Can you help me? So Russian training centers are about 90,000 people. Belarus training centers probably another 10 to 20,000. And that tells you that they will not be able to quickly mobilize and train. So the first mobilization wave was not too lucky. Half of them were used to plug in holes in the front, and the other part was trained for a couple months. Probably half of them got stuck on the training facilities, and they're showing some more or less decent battle worthiness, being at the front partially already, being deployed. For example, 106 paratroop division that they're using near Solidar is essentially the one that has a cadre corps of professional military, and then they also were fitted with additional mobilized. And they're showing pretty good results. But nobody knows how they're going to solve this question of 300 to 500,000 and to the ability to train them quickly. Me personally, Alexey Arestovych, I don't see how they can add another 100 or 200,000 troops ready for fighting. It'll take them at least several months. They can probably mobilize people and human resources. But where do they take supplies and weapons? Starting with uniform, food, tents, clothes, canteens, insignia, everything. The ones that they have now counted, those 200,000 that they gathered and which are partially here in the front. So, for example, that's tank battalion would have 10 tanks instead of 30. Or in mechanized infantry group, they would have 10 armored vehicles instead of 30. And they're not new ones. They're the ones which basically rotted down in their warehouses, and they somewhat made them run and brought them to the front. So what's their battle readiness on the front? A lot of big doubts about their effectiveness. And another question, which is huge, 200,000 mobilized is about 50,000 sergeants and about 40,000 commanding officers. Where? You cannot go and shop for a lieutenant or a sergeant. Of course, they are creating special training groups, so-called quick military officer courses, and they try to retrain the ones who graduated universities recently, or the ones who had some experience before. But 22-year-old boys and or 68-year-old gentlemen who already forgot how it was in the army, they are not exactly the most effective groups to command the troops that are being sent to carry out pretty sophisticated operations on the front. So, especially when the task is to attack fortified positions of the enemy, who may not overwhelm you numerically, but who definitely has an overwhelming advantage in the Western weapons and equipment. So, on one hand, they are pumping up that whole topic of threats about big war, and I think this is truly a psychological operation. On the other hand, they did aggregate extra 100,000, and we're all waiting for them to be thrown somewhere in the front. But outside of adding a little more pressure in certain select areas, we don't see. And we don't see formation of any strike groups that could be a threat, that could possibly, on operative level, cover 100 and 200 kilometers front and change things there. At maybe a tactical 40 or 50 kilometer length front, yeah, they can do something. But so I'm looking at these additional 100,000 and at the capacity to add an additional mobilized wave to that. I have serious questions about their efficacy. It might be the effort that will break them that'll untie their belly button to lift such a load. It's difficult to train the existing ones, outfit them, bring another 200,000, outfit and train them, and coordinate all that to make sure they're used effectively. I'm afraid Russian system doesn't have resources to do that. Okay. Another news. Did you hear Prigozhin suggested to ban YouTube and to try to bring responsibility on the shoulders of those who are watching YouTube? Oh, you know what I liked? I like that he said the old square is watching Fagin, and the old square is the old headquarters of the Communist Party in Moscow, and now it's the administration of the President of Russian Federation. So, first of all, hey, that's good news that they're watching us. He thinks that our activity is decaying their people and their views, and he thinks they need to do something to win. So the best way he can suggest is to prohibit and to punish those who will continue watching, because if you are listening to these enemies, that means you don't have motivation to continue fighting, which we have simple guys from Wagner. So arrest everybody, punish them, make them inmates, and turn them into Wagner troops, right? Yeah, exactly. I'm really curious to see how 140 million Russia will react to prohibition of YouTube if they try that. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Okay, yesterday I had Osechkin on my stream, and he talked a lot about Prigozhin, and he was saying that wasting of inmates on the front is an actual business operation that he suggested to Putin's admin. That basically it's a business operation in terms of, hey, you are wasting army on these inmates in the system. Instead, we can use them on the front to achieve maybe a small % of our goals, but also at the same time, you do not waste all that money for their food and upkeep in prison later. So, I have a question about his political future. The person who suggested a relatively smart, albeit evil plan to waste inmates in Russia and save money for Putin's regime. And also, why did they appoint Gerasimov at the moment when Prigozhin was about to take Solidar? You know, it's Prigozhin meme. He generated that his Wagner is taking Solidar. Solidar was being taken by about a mix of 30-30-30. Wagner, so-called armies of so-called Donetsk and Lugansk region, and another 30% were special forces and paratroopers of Russian Federation, mostly 106th Division. And remember those hodgepodge different messages that we took Solidar by Prigozhin, and then paratroops said we blocked Solidar, but the fighting continues. The only ones they don't mention are the mobilized and the whatever is remaining from the second corps of People's Militia of so-called Donetsk Republic. But they're actually much more battle-worthy than Wagner or paratroopers. And Prigozhin's Wagner were mostly used as instructors, as professional guns for hire, until they got to the city fights. They were basically aggregating those inmates and then sending them to the front lines, trying to preclude them from running by shooting them in the backs. When they got to Solidar, they had to train some people to do the city fights. And in order to take Solidar, they needed to surround the city. It's a big operation. They had to surround it, to flank it on both sides, and then to start going street by street. Wagner did walk more than the others in that operation, but obviously not more than both others' forces combined. And why was Gerasimov appointed during the Solidar? Probably because he has training enough to use different types of military resources together to coordinate that effort. And if you add additional people who do not have enough training, enough previous experience of using all these combinations of different forces, you will be diluting the efficacy. So Gerasimov has some experience how to coordinate different kinds of troops, and he doesn't need any additional layers of command between him and the troops, and it makes it a little more effective on the Russian side in management. Does it mean that in Kremlin it indicates the victory of the group that that is closer to the system versus the new faces like Prigozhin and Kadyrov? Yeah, I think it does. I think it means that systemic military is definitely winning in this internal fight. And I think China could express some questions about, hey, are you still a country, or you already have people commanding your troops who are telling F off to the heads of your military command, and we don't know how to treat you? That could have been a factor, that question posed by China. So I think it's, strengthening of their typical government orgs and typical military orgs. What was more concerning for me is revival of Lapin. Revival after administrative death is a very rare occurrence in that ecosystem. And he was first almost destroyed and then dusted off and put back up in command. So for me, that was actually the biggest indicator that the systemic military branch is winning over Prigozhin's and other enforcement groups, because in order to bring up that figure, one needed to have a very serious effect on Putin. And I think military groups apparently had Putin's ear. They did tell him that we need to bring that person back, because he did come back, and he came back to a commanding position, because the commander of the ground troops is basically about 70% of supplies of that group that is fighting on the front. Paratroops have a little different supply line, but as a part of a group operating on the front, they, to a bigger degree, still depend upon the ground troops' supply. Not really talking about Kadyrov and Prigozhin troops. So, yeah, Lapin is now a big figure again. I don't know if one can believe Prigozhin's statements that he was flying and negotiating, and he was not supported by other groups in Russian military. So the thing is, his troops are totally dependent on Russian military in terms of support, aviation, artillery, and such. And right now, there are people in command of all these resources whom they basically flicked off and tried to publicly decimate them. So now these people have a chance to not supply enough, or not supply in time, or send Prigozhin troops somewhere where there is a zero chance to survive. And trust me, they will use this capability to orchestrate some revenge. Okay, yeah, I can see that happening too. Thank you. So I had another question about Solidar, how critical it is, what happened there. And recently Roman Svetan told me basically like this. So there was a lot of noise that Wagner people took Solidar, almost took it. And after such noise, it would make sense to add more troops from Constantinople to Solidar. But all attacks near Constantinople, were repelled. But in Solidar, there is one outpost that is still being held, so it's impossible to use that as effective tool to attack Bakhmut from the north. So on one hand, battles for Solidar continue, fighting is still happening there, but the main supply lines that support Bakhmut are not taken. So Solidar is taken only as far as those supply lines are not threatened. And it appears that Ukrainian command did not bite, did not waste their resources, and did not move more of them to Solidar. So it's interesting. What do you think about that? I do not have exact data about Russian command ideation. Did they indeed promise or did want to our troops to be moved out from Constantinople to enforce Solidar so they could take that? I can say Solidar is a bloody battle for both sides. Ukrainian soldiers, there were nights when a company could lose up to 20 people due to the frostbite, who had to have fingers amputated on their foot or on a hand, and that lasted for days. And there were a lot of sacrifice, a lot of heroism on our side. But there were also situations when people suffered severe psychological traumas as a result of those activities. And this is the main direction of enemy attack. This is not a resort. This is where they concentrated everything that's fighting, everything that's exploding. And regardless of that, our troops were acting according to the plan, and they're continuing to do that. So Solidar is mostly in the laying on the low-lying plain. Our troops are mostly located now on the heights around the central area. So Russian troops are regrouping in the middle, in the lower land, and it's very difficult to try to capture heights from that area. They can be regrouping, but it's a bad perspective. It's similar to the Donetsk airport, which we celebrated yesterday, the defense of which. So Russian troops managed to capture 1 out of 4 areas there, and the remaining 3 were standing. And they celebrated, saying, "Hey, we got 1 piece, but they failed to take 3 others, and they're still standing, and our troops are still holding them." So it's not exactly a good perspective when you have enemy troops about 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers away from your downtown. So same thing here. It's a smaller town, but still they basically ran into the prepared position of Ukrainian military, which are still held. They took 1 part of the defense line, but overall the line still stands. They just took 1 element of it. So I don't know if their calculation was to move the troops from Constantinople and to weaken that part, but they will not be able to blow it into a big military victory, even on the propaganda style, because now they're at stalemate with our new defense lines there, and it'll take them quite a bit of time to plow through that, even if they manage to. I have doubts that they will. This is the reality that I told them times and times again that they can take something, but they'll run into the next defense line. Then they can run into the next defense line. And this one doesn't have perspectives. So if you were taking this element for 5 months and wasted 80,000 doing so, how far and how long do you think you can go? These 200,000 that they called upon will run out real fast if they continue with the same military style. So despite the tactical success locally, strategically, this is a completely useless event. So why Putin did crawl into the screens again from his bunker? He wanted to announce the new goals of this operation, to defend peoples of Donetsk and Lugansk regions. So that new goal, Alexey, smells real bad, like it was dusted off from the Soviet times or the early stages of this campaign. Well, kinda, yeah. But another note, he is not mentioning Kherson and the southern front, right? So what happened there? And Gerasimov apparently now has a task to take the whole Donetsk region before the end of February, the 24th of February. So imagine how long and how much resources it'll take him to take that, because there are towns like Solidar in that area, probably about 40. Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, and Drushkovka, they are agglomerations much bigger than Bakhmut. So what's his perspective? All these tens of thousands wasted Russian soldiers, regardless if they are inmates or soldiers or mobilized, they died for what? If it was a cruel Stalin and Zhukov arithmetic, we lose troops but we achieve the goals, one could have explained that somehow. It's inhumane, but it's rational. But they're failing to do even that. for the Second Army of the World, which was threatening to push NATO to take Solidar after 5 months of storming. That is like in that old anecdote about the mice, or this one is more about the fleas on these mice, or even the fleas of these mice. So this is my estimate of what's happening there. And I think now even civilians understand, or start to understand, that the ones on the Russian side, they're probably getting the light bulb lit now, that however the mobilizer used on the front, they don't bring any results home, but the body bags and the death notes. Because even Solidar is not fully taken. Defense is holding. They've captured just a portion of it by wasting 80,000 troops. I'm not even talking about the mythology and propagandists and the greatness of Russia that they've been battling recently. Now it's totally lacking perspective. Okay, that was Yulia Latynina and Alexey Arestovych, who have been live for about 50 minutes. About 42,000 people watching us today. Please do not forget to subscribe to us and to Alexey, and of course to the Privateer station if you are watching that in English. And I have a ton more questions, but I do want to ask you one. And this is a higher level aggregation than Solidar and tactical situation. At the beginning of this stream, we've been laughing a little bit about Russian missiles, that they smell like something that was taken from storage. But it does appear that overall military technology were not really being effectively developed in the last 30 years, or at least they were lagging behind the consuming industries, the consumer electronics and stuff. And that was maybe one of the signs that gave an ideation to Putin that they can compete with the free world militarily. Do you not have a feeling that this war is going to revive the military defense systems? Because we have heard that Germany can't even print enough tanks. But might even cause a revolution in the military complex, similar to what we've seen in the consumer electronics, because the only defense of the free world is that they have to be separated technologically by ages of technology between them and dictatorships. Just like in the 17th century, there were countries divided by military technological abyss, so dictators could not take over earlier democracies. And yeah, those military differences exist. The weapons of the West were still evolving. Maybe not as huge as consumer electronics, true, but qualitatively they overwhelmingly provide better tools than what Russia has now, starting with more precise missiles and intercept systems, and even to the lower level rifles and night vision systems. But I'm talking about, the generational differences. Yulia, it often comes down to generals, two commanding generals who give the right results and right estimations. It's not even about the military advantage. Russian general, remember Ivashov, before the beginning of this campaign, he came out and said Russia will lose. And the rest of the military just didn't have enough balls to stand with him and say, no, we should not start that. So that system is very poor. In any dictatorship, including Russian dictatorship, is really poor in transforming objective data and generals' will into political goals. In democracies, it's pretty bad too. Things happen. People told Margaret Thatcher that this is unobtainium when she wanted to send the expeditionary corps to the Falkland Islands, but she did send them and they achieved their goals, but only because they had better tools and they had certain resources in the society. Here, dramatic difference in whatever you take, missiles, aviation, everything in the West is 3 heads taller than in Russia or any other dictatorship. The difference exists, it's just that NATO doesn't fight much. If NATO was fighting, everything would be over really quickly. So that's my bold question. If right now we have an overwhelming advantage, why are we not seeing that overwhelming advantage on the battlefront in Ukraine? You talked a lot about the tanks with Mark, about tanks that the West is starting to supply. With all respect to tanks, they have never played a big role as the jet fighters did in the recent campaigns. Yulia, tanks do play a significant role. For example, in Israel, they are one of the strongest components by the quality and the efficacy. And in 2003 war, they also played a really good role, important one. Here's a different thing, though. In order for us to fight like NATO, we need to have everything like NATO, starting with the quality of people, economy, industry, industrial production, political administration, media, and military is just a cherry on top. We still, unfortunately, have remnants of a Soviet school to a big degree. Our bet is still on the armored vehicles, which is traditionally weaker with NATO countries. So NATO cannot just transfer NATO army to this, or just refit our army and turn them magically into NATO system, because it's not just the army that's fighting, it's the whole society and system that's fighting. In order to fight like NATO, you have to have NATO industry and NATO traditions and NATO culture. They are helping us to transition, and it takes time. And I think they already set the goal for us to do that. And I think by the end of war, we'll probably be at about 50% through with this path, maybe even more. But the task after the first meeting in Ramstein is to upgrade the whole army. And that was the first statement made by our allies to change our Ukrainian troops on the NATO, according to the NATO standards. And they are doing it. It's just slow. It takes time, and it's not just military. It's different layers of socioeconomic life. So now they're trying to support the army that cannot bet on aviation heavily as NATO does. They're trying to fit the element of army which they traditionally do not have much. And we have an emphasis on that. So it is a difficult task to solve. They're doing their best, and we are very thankful for their effort. You see, even gathering 100 tanks from the whole NATO is a big problem, apparently. And this is just 1/8 of the number of tanks that we had when we started this war. So we have what we have. It'll be difficult and long, but it's going and it's strengthening. The machine is starting to work faster and better. It'll be interesting to see what decisions will be made in Ramstein. And they're not giving us the best, right, and the top level, but they're providing a good systemic support. And it's interesting to see what new perspectives are going to be outlined. Several statements by Stoltenberg and some other faces. Stoltenberg is the head of NATO. They're saying that the gates for different types of munitions are opening wider and wider for Ukraine. So maybe we are in queue for good surprises. I suspect we are. The question is more about the size of it. And we can discuss that after Ramstein next week. Next week will be interesting. All right. This was Yulia Latynina and Alexey Arestovych. Alexey, everybody is sending you the words of support and cheer in our chat. One person is writing here, when I was talking about victims in Dnieper and comparing them with victims in Kramatorsk, Dnieper will probably will top Kramatorsk in terms of civilian casualties. People are saying that I forgot to count the victims in the theater in Mariupol. Those were not ever counted, right? Yeah, Yulia, Mariupol had colossal score in victims. I think eventually when we calculate deaths there, it'll be a very devastating figure. But unfortunately, it was difficult to calculate because the city was encircled and the information was reaching us very sporadically. But the most, I wouldn't use the word optimistic, but the lowest estimation is 25,000 civilians dead in Mariupol. The worst I've heard is about 100,000. And dramatic theater is, definitely a sad marker in that. Alexey, thank you so much. Goodbye, and talk to you next week. Everybody is sending you a ton of good words. If I'll be reading that, we'll read for another hour. The amount of likes, thanks, and kisses here in the chat. That's very reciprocal. I work for you too. Thank you.
Это все взаимно. Я же для вас и работаю. Спасибо за внимание.